It's exciting to have everyone here, and we're really lucky to have a passionate panel of researchers and workers in the alternative protein field here tonight to talk to us about their career path so far, what they found useful, and how they're using their skills to do good in the world. So it's good to see everyone sort of made some input into the word cloud, and I guess by the end of this, we'll all have a clearer understanding and be more knowledgeable on the topic. So before we start, we'd like to acknowledge that we're on the lands of the Wurundjeri people who have been custodians of this land for thousands of years, and acknowledge and pay our respects to their elders past and present. So I guess, yeah, so it's the effective altruism group from the UniMelb is combined with the alternative protein club, and I guess seeing how both of these sort of intertwine together. So a bit of an overview for tonight. This evening, we've brought together 3 experts to each give us a brief talk outlining their respective careers and their involvement in the world of alternative proteins, before the audience members will be given a chance to ask questions to these 3 panelists in a question and answer section. And I think there's going to be a link shared to the chat where, as the speakers are talking, questions can be put in, and then at the end, so you don't forget what you want to ask them, you can do it along the way, and then they'll be asked all together at the end. But before we hear from our speakers, Marion, as the president of the UniMelb Alternative Protein Initiative, will briefly outline alternative proteins, how alternative proteins relate to effective altruism, and what some career pathways in alternative proteins are.
All right, thank you for that, Sophie. Yeah, I'll just quickly go through some things with you. So yeah, as Sophie said, I am Marion. Nice to meet you. But first of all, I think you might be asking, so if you're new to alternative proteins, what is this anyway, right? So according to Good Food Institute, alternative proteins are described as meats, eggs, or dairy products that are plant-based, cultivated, or fermentation derived. And in that, you got plant-based protein, which is produced directly from plants and is composed of proteins, fats, vitamins, minerals, and water, just like conventional meat. Like, for example, someone said TVP, that would be a plant-based protein. But you also have next generation plant-based meat which looks and tastes more like conventional meat, just like Beyond Meat, for example. You've also got cultivated proteins as well, which are directly produced from animal cells using the process of cellular agriculture. It's awesome to know that all the word cloud, words are popping out as I talk about this, testing your knowledge. Yes, so you also got fermentation derived proteins as well, which are made using one of 3 production types or technologies, including like traditional fermentation, biomass fermentation, for example, corn from the supermarket that's produced using mycoproteins, as well as the process of precision fermentation. And it's really exciting because you can make such vast ranges of foods and additives using these technologies. I know that you're all hearing the people coming in and out. Sorry about that. I also want to point out that even though these are all defined as 3 types of alternative proteins, a lot of this are all merging together. There's new products being made where they use technologies from all 3 or a couple. So I'd like to talk about how alternative protein relates to effective altruism. So effective altruism, or EA, seeks to answer the question of how best and most efficiently can we do the most good for the world. And then from this seemingly simple question comes an immense amount of discussion and debate within the EA community. So, alongside other cause areas, improving and promoting alternative proteins is highlighted as a space which can massively impact, which can have massive impact, both in reducing animal suffering as well as helping combat climate change. So because this is a career-related event, I'll quickly talk about some of the ways you might get involved in the alternative protein space. So yeah, this space is rapidly expanding. There are careers in the academic side of things. So you're exploring the cutting edge of human knowledge through research and educating students and members of the workforce. There are also openings for jobs within designing and tweaking new alternative protein products. For example, you've got cultivated meats, just being a concept back in 2013 before Mark Post's lab created this first cultivated meat burger. And then they created a company around it called Moza Meat. So you could be starting your own alternative protein company, but also you can be a manager, a VC like Simon, or do marketing for alternative protein companies. So beyond this, there are many opportunities to influence policy to subsidize alternative protein research, or influence advertising or labeling regulations within a governmental position. Then you've also got non-for-profit organizations that are promoting alternative protein products in a national or international context. And there's different ways that they go about doing this, right? They could be providing research grants or lobbying governments, educating the public, conducting research, or providing other resources to relevant people, all to accelerate the advancements of alternative proteins. So I also see Lisa from Cellular Agriculture Australia here, so shout out to her. And also because Cellular Agriculture Australia has a pathways tool that you can see right on the right-hand side, which is a really useful tool if you're interested in figuring out how you want to navigate a career in cellular agriculture from a STEM perspective. But they're also developing a non-STEM pathways tool as well, so make sure you check that out. So as you can see, there are various career opportunities available, and it's not all about the research, as much as that is also very important. So all organized institutions need a range of people, so it's really a hands-on deck kind of situation. And if you are interested, there's also vocational boards available by the Good Food Institute, so you can apply to alternative protein jobs worldwide. And if you are considering research as a career pathway and you're a University of Melbourne student, there's also a Future Food Hallmark Research Initiative that specializes in alternative protein research. And I'm sure you'll hear more about that soon. But I think I'll pass it on to Sophie now.
Oh, thanks, Marianne. So I think that's sort of given us a good base to start with. And now we'll hear from our panelists to hear more about their specific careers. So we've been joined tonight by 3 experts to each give a brief talk outlining their respective careers and involvement in the world of alternative proteins. So this includes Dr. Jen Lacey-Nichols, Simon Newstead, and Clara Culuxy. So our first speaker tonight is Dr. Jen Lacey-Nichols, who is an academic specialist in non-communicable diseases at the University of Melbourne and has previously been involved in AltPro related research at the university's Future Food Hallmark Research Initiative. In particular, she's explored the political practices and commercialization of food systems, including alternative proteins. So thank you, Jen. Looking forward to hearing from you.
All right, cool. So I've thrown together a few slides and per some of the directions that Effective Altruism gave me, I'll chat about 4 things. First, thanks so much for having me. I'll say I have worked with the Future Food Hallmark project at the University of Melbourne. I'm not working on this topic at the moment, but I do have I'll chat a bit about some of my research and then I suppose how my current field intersects with this, because I think there's a lot of interesting pathways. And I think especially from that research lens, there's so many different perspectives that can come into this space. It's really fascinating to see the questions that get asked around this. So my 4 things, I'll chat about a little bit about my career pathway, how I got here, and the very meandering pathway that was. I'll talk a bit about the research that I'm doing right now around commercial determinants of health and how that intersects with alternative proteins. I'll give you a very brief snapshot of the project that I did while I was part of the Hallmark Research Project on alternative proteins, and then just a few reflections, I guess, around that topic of future food, alternative proteins, potential opportunities and pathways. So there we go. This is my meandering career. I grew up in the United States and all of my research has involved food in some way, shape or form. I started looking at organic and biodynamic farming when I was in South India for an ethnographic research project. I've done research on farmers markets and food insecurity. I had a brief stint where I was in Japan as a kindergarten teacher, which cultivated my love of teaching. And I find that teaching in terms of that academic career is a really important element of research translation. My PhD was in the Faculty of Veterinary and Agricultural Sciences, where the Future Food Hallmark project is located. And that was looking at how the soft drink industry was responding to obesity and trying to reposition itself as part of the solution. And that theme of corporations that have this public relations issue being perceived as part of the problem to a huge global intractable problem, like obesity, like climate change, like other issues, is sort of the theme that I bring then into that alternative protein space. And since then, I've moved into the School of Population and Global Health. So I've taken a little bit more of a public health turn in my more recent research, but I've always been interested in food systems. So I come with an anthropological political science approach to these issues. And on the bottom, you'll see some of the other career interruptions and career activities in terms of civil society. That is my adorable baby, who I don't think will interrupt me tonight, but if I suddenly disappear, we're going to blame it on that cute little bundle of joy. So thinking about how your career has research impact, I guess I think of it around sort of three guiding questions, because, you know, there's that question of what do you see as the problem? There are lots of problems in the world, but some of them are going to be seen more important or urgent to you. I am all about inequity. I tried to create a little visual, and I was thinking about what do I worry about? What is the thing that keeps me up at night, and why in God's name am I doing this research on weekends and working on grant proposals and doing all of these chaotic things? And I'd much rather go to the swimming pool with my baby. And so all of my work is about inequity, this unfairness, the fact that people do not have equal access to opportunities through the chance and the lives that we were born into. Some people have a better go than others. And in terms of my research, I am especially interested in corporate power, in conflicts of interest, wealth disparities, whether that's between, you know, wealthy individuals or corporations, or even on that sort of national scale between the global north and south. Capitalism comes up in my research. And then in that more sort of food system space, I think about unhealthy food systems. So I very much focus on that systems level, food environment level when I'm thinking about some of the problems. And then how you define the problem then thinks, you know, that informs how you identify the solutions and those opportunities. But then there's also that theory of change. And so on the right, I have some of the organizations I've worked with, and they have different approaches to how to move the dial around this. So tobacco-free portfolios, if you don't know, is around sort of divesting. So trying to get pension funds to divest from tobacco, and divestment's now a tool that's used in climate change. It's used around other public health issues. So that's sort of an interesting lever when you're looking at large financial institutions. You know, where does the money go and come from? I've done consulting work for the World Health Organization, so if you're thinking about trying to develop policies at that global level that then filter through to national states and those rules and regulations, that's a potential lever. I've done stuff with the People's Health Movement, and they are a grassroots, you know, global South civil society movement that advocates for change very much from the ground up at that community level. And then I also do teaching and research at the University of Melbourne. So, and there's far more than this, but these are just some of the ways that you can try to think through what are some of those opportunities for change. So what I do, my research is around the commercial determinants of health. This is an infographic that I sort of clumsily built together and sort of built on year. But the commercial determinants of health are the ways in which commercial actors and influence health outcomes. This can be for positive, this could be for good. I can talk about the fact that, you know, I've got like a good parental leave program, and, you know, you can talk about the gender equity in terms of pay, you can talk about the quality of work, you can talk about exploitation in the labor system, we can talk about gender inequities, we can talk about pollution, we can talk about capitalism, multi-stakeholderism, the mining industry, fossil fuels. You know, there's good, there's bad, it's all very complicated. And that messy thing is what my research is about: corporations, politics, and health. And so thinking about commercial determinants, there are other elements then that are perhaps a bit more tangible. So I think about the commercial determinants of academia. You have to pay thousands of dollars to publish an open access journal so that people can actually read my research. You're paying quite a bit of money to get this education. We increasingly see the privatization of the university sector and pressure from governments to commercialize research. We talk about research translation, but it doesn't necessarily mean making it a public good. It means, you know, profiting from it and perhaps privatizing it. We could talk about commercial determinants of the media and the Murdoch Corporation, or the justice system, or climate change, or housing, or a whole myriad of things. So food environments is the topic for the remainder of this. But that's where I come from. I'm interested in who has power and what the consequences of that are in terms of that equity question. So what I was doing when I was part of the Hallmark project was I did a project focusing on nutrition. I've just pulled out a very few slides. It's a much more complicated, longer project. I'm happy to answer more questions about this. But we essentially audited all of the front of pack labels and website claims that were made by the largest companies that had invested in the alternative protein sector. Think Nestle, think Tyson, Cargill, some of those large players. Significantly, they all have non-alternative protein products. So Cargill, for instance, it's a huge trader. We had JBS, they're one of the largest meat producers in Brazil, but they've all invested in this space. So we tried to look at how are they talking about alternative proteins? What are some of those health and nutrition claims that are made? We classified them. These are some of the high level things that we found out, most of them, unsurprisingly, about protein. A lot of claims around GMO free. This is a US based study. There was an Australia audit. This is the US based one. A lot of them around that language of plant based. And then quite a few around vegan vegetarianism as well. The other thing we looked at was some of the nutrients that they were referring to. So again, the vast majority around protein. We also saw some around fiber, iron, and vitamin B12, and then we saw sort of the negative claims, so free from, low in, etc. One of the things that was interesting around this is that all of the nutrients here are really ones that are relevant when you're talking about meat. So unlike other sort of formulated products, it wasn't that they were fortifying it with all kinds of other things that you wouldn't naturally find in meat. So it's like we were pumping it full of, phytosterols or other bits and pieces. They really were trying to craft the claims in relation to meat. Fiber was the only exception there in terms of some of those claims. So it's interesting in terms of all of those health and nutrition claims very much sort of existing within that meat landscape, which we thought was interesting. And the last thing we looked at was in regards to ultra processing. So some of my other research has looked at ultra processing in terms of dietary guidelines. And we looked at the language that the different companies use to talk about processing. And I'll say the data collection was conducted a little over a year ago. But if you're aware, if you're following any of the media, there was this whole stoush between Beyond Beef and Impossible and Light Life and these sort of corporations trying to say, some of these are hyper processed, we're more natural, but trying to see essentially the extent to which corporations were overt or not about the use of different additives of processing, and some of the sort of growing acknowledgement that there is concern about ultra processing, that there's pressure from governments, from public health organizations to respond to this. We essentially found that very few companies were especially forthcoming about this. Impossible Foods was the one exception, and they took a very sort of defensive stance around that. Again, sort of mapping the landscape of how they talked about it. So that was our study. And then I guess the last 3 slides were just some of my reflections, taking that commercial determinants of health line, or that commercial determinants lens. If we're thinking about the future of food and alternative proteins, what are we trying to change and what is being ignored? And so this is my sort of, if you've seen social determinants of health, it's that concept of levels, right, of change. So we can start at the very bottom. We can think about, are we changing the ingredients in the products? And a lot of the conversation around alternative proteins tends to focus at that level. Then you can think perhaps about the dietary patterns, and there's some emerging studies around, if people are adopting alternative proteins into their diet, what sort of change is this having? Is it in addition to meat? Is it replacing the meat? Is it substituting for something else? Like, what are some of those broader implications at that sort of population level? Then you could go step up and think about, okay, well, who are the food producers, processors, traders, and retailers? Do we have new actors coming into this place? Is it the same actors? What's the diversity? I was looking at some of the largest, most powerful food corporations. It's an incredibly concentrated sector. So to what extent is this disrupting the industrial food system or simply replicating those existing dynamics? You've got food environments and systems up at the top. Sorry, those are some of the questions that I would like addressed, I think, moving forward in the alternative protein space. There's a really great report that I think I said you guys could circle. I'd sent that on to, I think, Sophie, one of the organizers. But IPES Food is one of sort of the leading food system researchers in the world. And I've just published this report last week. I'll say it is not complimentary. It is not a complimentary report to alternative proteins. It's a very critical report. But I think they ask some really important questions that some in the alternative protein space do grapple with, but many others do not. And I think these are some of the important questions from a sort of equity standpoint that do need to be considered. So, are we addressing, are we asking all of the questions? When we ask one particular question, are there other ones that we're not perhaps answering? And so I guess my last sort of recommendation around this is, if we're thinking of theories of change, what are sort of the things that we're trying to change? Do we change this in terms of consumer campaigns? Do we change this in terms of getting corporations to change their portfolios? Is this sort of government and regulation? What sort of regulation is in this space? What do we need in this space? Who drives change? And importantly for that, what sort of implications are there for accountability and democracy in this space? If governments are driving this and there's regulations attached to it, if businesses are doing this voluntarily, I think there's some interesting questions around that. And then I guess what I think would be very useful in this space is some of that community-based global south innovation. There's some really interesting alternative protein startups in Africa and in some other regions of the world. They're small, they're community-based. I think having that is a really important dynamic if we're thinking about some of that global south wealth extraction, neo-colonial dynamics that come in this space. A lot of it's sort of global north focused. Similarly, cooperatives, alternative forms of business, very interesting. Regulation, and then I would just say make sure the tech doesn't distract from the deep issues. That's all for me. I hope I didn't speak for too long.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Jen. Very interesting work that you're doing, and you sound like you're very passionate about it. So thanks for sharing that with us. And make sure if anyone has any more questions on that at any time, just the link's in the chat, so just put them in and Jen will speak to us again later. So we'll move on to our second speaker for this evening, which is Simon Newstead, who is one of Asia Pacific's primary alternative protein venture capitalists, investing in early stage alt-pro startups. Simon most recently co-founded Better Bite Ventures, an early stage investment company that has supported an impressive list of alt-pro startups. So welcome, Simon.
Great, thanks very much. Let me share my screen, which I can do now, thank you. Can everyone see it okay? All right, awesome. Yeah, thanks for the chance to chat with you all. It's nice to be, I think this is the first time I've ever done a talk at University of Melbourne, so it's kind of cool to go back to my my old kind of home. I have really fun memories of skipping lectures to play basketball during my engineering degree. So it's really cool to be able to chat with passionate people who are really caring about the future of the world and how animals and how this alternative protein kind of plays into that. And, I really kind of, hats off for taking the initiative to being interested and involved in this space. So yeah, my name's Simon. I'm based here in Melbourne, second home in Hong Kong. And my focus is as an impact investor in alternative protein. And I've been asked to kind of share a little bit about my journey to kind of get here. So maybe I'll start with that first. So it started off with like maybe a lot of you folks, which is kind of a worry about suffering in the world. And, that, happened at a young age and, seeing that things weren't fair in the world and people were kind of, suffering, in many different ways. And that was kind of like the first kind of thing that got me started down this path. And then, so I started to do donating. I was kind of early in my career and I was kind of, a decent kind of job as an engineer and started donating extra income to, mostly poverty related causes. And that was kind of like semi-random, like, a tsunami happened and I would go and donate, or, I'd feel bad about, starving people in Africa. And then I would go and donate. It wasn't very structured, but I was like, taking first baby steps into this kind of effective altruism kind of movement. Started thinking about it. I couldn't logically justify why we eat animals. I mean, I tried, I love meat, but I just went through that thought process and I just couldn't come up with a good reason. Studied, philosophers, couldn't come up with a good reason. So I said, okay, well, I need to kind of live in an alignment with my values. So I kind of went vegan, and that was about 12 years ago. So I got involved in that. I was pretty passionate. So I did activism, protests, outside of slaughterhouses, doing media, organizing anti-fur march, talking on TV, doing that sort of stuff. And that was kind of cool. And there was kind of an energy to that. But I felt like, looking back, it wasn't perhaps the only way to do it. And there needs to be more systemic change. And so I thought, okay, organizing. So I started doing kind of, how to go vegan workshops and et cetera, et cetera. And then I realized, well, you can push someone, but pushing doesn't really work. You want to have some sort of pull factor. And so products are really important. I think in, psychology, it's far easier to change your identity if your behavior has already changed. So how can we go and invest in better products? So I started doing angel investing into alternative protein. Then I guess, 2-3 years back, I started to kind of do some more structured EA learning. I actually kind of thought, okay, I better go and read this and understand. And that kind of really helped to inform, my thinking about career. And that led to deciding to kind of do this as a day job. So, I'm impact investor by day job, and that kind of like has impact, hopefully, in a big way, but also that gives me funds as an earn to give. So, my intention is to basically to give all my funds away before I'm dead. On the side project side, I have a couple of other projects, but if anyone's interested, I can share more about them in another time. So that's kind of like the journey to get here from an EA point of view. Let's just talk about the why. I think, health is really important, especially human health. I mean, we're kind of, life expectancy in Western nations, in many Western nations, is going down. It's not going up, which is kind of ridiculous if you think about it with all the medical advancements. And so I won't talk about that, but I do want to talk about the sentient suffering part. So I'm sure people here are pretty interested in this space, but the weight of chickens has gone up tremendously. So KFC, if you have KFC they basically are accepting 5%, just under 5% of death rate in chickens. And you imagine how heavy those chickens are. They literally cannot support the weight. Imagine if you kind of had fractures in your bones and you had to kind of walk all your life like that. It would be intense suffering. And I think it's kind of a travesty what happens. So that's kind of a pretty fundamental reason. Also, if you think about something like pigs, which are very, they're highly intelligent, they're sentient, arguably more intelligent than dogs, ability to form social relationships, emotion, and they're put into gestation crates, and the mums are basically stuck there. They literally can't turn around. They can't go and, do the things that, to have some basic level of well-being. And, don't get me started on fish and seafood and so forth. So putting aside all the industry stuff and all the, transition and how do we package this and label this, like fundamentally, alternative protein is a way to kind of address immense suffering, which is directly under our control. And I think humans have to evolve. And I think that we can play an important part. All of us here on this call can play an important part in this. So moving on to Asia, which is the focus of this fund that we're doing at Better Bite Ventures. So Asia is the red graph. So this is all of the global meat production until very recently. It's continuing to grow. Years and years of activism, of people talking about veganism. Meat consumption is increasing. Per capita meat consumption is increasing. Asia is increasing the most, and it's already the largest region. And we've got a rising middle class and increasing affluence. So the problem is getting worse, not better. And humans being humans, and you mentioned efficiencies and capitalism, those companies don't care about animal welfare versus this kind of like bottom line calculation. So I think it's a growing problem. And if you look at from a kind of our ITN framework point of view, obviously the importance is high. The tractability, I would argue, is kind of medium, and it's getting higher. The neglectedness, particularly for Asia, is extremely high because Asia is a very, very small percent of the amount of money that's been invested into this field, despite being the largest protein market, the fastest growing protein market. Basically, the future of humanity is going to be, in this particular space, is going to be decided in our backyard here in Asia Pacific. So what we did is decided to go and start this VC. And We invest in several different technology streams. And you've seen some of those words in the word cloud before. So plant-based, cultivated or cell-based, fermentation, both biomass and precision fermentation, and a new area which is called molecular farming, which is basically engineering plants to natively contain animal compounds so that they can, you can extract, the usual plant materials from those plants, but you also get animal compounds from those. And we've made our first investment in that space, which is incidentally a New Zealand company. We've invested also in, for example, in Melbourne in Me And, which is doing cultivated breast milk. So humans aren't designed to drink from cows. I mean, we're designed to drink from humans, so infants. So can we go and provide that? Can we do it in a much better way and obviously a more sustainable and a much more EA friendly way? So, this is a picture from our portfolio company on the plant-based side, Green Rebel out of Indonesia. And we've got actually started by an effective altruist, Yang Zeliang, who started CellX to basically do cultivated meat in China, which is the world's largest meat market by some stretch. And that's very exciting, and we're really kind of fortunate to kind of get behind, and it's kind of rare that we see an EA actually starting a company, but there's a couple in our portfolio already. Okay, finally, on the pathway side, so this is kind of like in summary my journey to become an investor, if you want to go down that path. It's basically was an engineer, then moved into sales and leadership, and then moved into entrepreneurship, so starting my own companies in software and then in food, and then doing angel investing, and then finally kind of ending up as starting this VC fund. So in a way, you could summarize it and say, gaining skills and then actually getting operational experience, so being an operator, going and starting your own projects. And then on the investing side, gaining a bit of a track record, and then obviously building the network. And then using those two or multiple things to then go and springboard into doing the fundraise and being able to successfully bring on board funds. So that's just one path. There's multiple paths in there, and I'm happy to help out if anyone's interested in pursuing this. We can go into it in the Q&A or kind of separately if anyone's interested. So opportunities. I think there's many challenges to be solved, and therefore challenges are opportunities. So obviously there's taste and texture innovation. Like Impossible gets pretty close to real beef, but it's not quite there yet. And other ones are kind of lower down. So we still need to work on multiple fronts to kind of close that gap and then pass meat. So the goal is within the next 10 years, we want to pass meat. We want to be tastier, healthier, all of the attributes that we care about. Talent, not just technology, but we need marketers. We need people who kind of understand consumers and kind of work on that. We need local processing. We need infrastructure investments. We also need to have on the biotech side, kind of, more scale up R&D happening, and obviously the build outs. We need regulatory support and people working on those important issues. And obviously we need investment, and I would argue we need a lot more investment. And so, we need more people on board. Lastly, I just wanted to put up a quick slide, which is kind of a little bit adjacent or maybe out of scope a little bit, but I think it's important. And so kind of indulge me for 1 minute, which is related EA opportunities to alternative protein. Wild animal suffering. I'm actually really passionate about this. I don't think it's as tractable, but it needs to be worked on. And I think long-term it is tractable. So it's a minuscule amount of effort that's gone into wild animal suffering. And that's both real as well as AI simulated or computer system simulated suffering. So I'd encourage anyone who's really kind of ambitious and wants to work on something that they may not see the fruits of in their lifetime, but will be very important. I would encourage that work, and I'd be happy to get behind it. On that topic, S risks in general. So, I think there's plenty of S risks that need more work on. And then just a general thing about expanding our moral circle. I mean, humans in this day and age, how can we still, exploit sentient animals? It doesn't make sense. So we've got a lot of work to do on products, but also on generally expanding the moral circle. So yeah, that's an overview. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Simon. And again, it's so inspiring to see the passion in your work, and especially how your EA passion is incorporated into your work. So thank you. And again, any questions, put them in the link, and we'll hear from Simon again later. So our final speaker we're going to hear from is Clara Koloski, she is a researcher and content manager at Food Frontier, which is an independent think tank and an advisor on alternative proteins working towards accelerating global protein diversification. Her work is focused on synthesizing literature surrounding alternative proteins and researching the nutrition of commercially available plant-based products in Australia. So welcome, Clara.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for having me. Before I begin, I just want to acknowledge the traditional owners of where I am today, the Camaragal people of the Eora Nation. And I also want to apologize in advance. I'm looking after my parents' puppy, so if you hear weird noises, she's currently chewing on my gumboot. So let me share my screen. So yes, as mentioned, I am the research and content manager at Food Frontier. Food Frontier is an independent think tank on alternative proteins in Australia and New Zealand. And we kind of focus on plant-based meat and products produced by cellular agriculture. Our vision is a nutritious, sustainable, and future-proofed protein supply. While there definitely are other areas that fall into alternative proteins, such as like dairy replacements, insects, and algae, we're really small organizations, so we have to focus our energy on just 2 areas. And even just in those 2 areas, there's so much to cover. I'll also preface my presentation by saying that I'm quite early in my career of alternative proteins. So I've been at Food Frontier since January 2020. And I did not intend to start at start in alternative proteins. It's been a windy journey to get here. So I began my career working in communications. I have a Bachelor of Arts, Public Relations, Organizational Communications, which I completed in 2011 from Charles Sturt University. I then spent 5 years working in communications roles for global agencies like Ogilvy and Sling & Stone. And I mostly worked for startup and tech companies. So companies like Twitter, Slack, Microsoft, Toshiba, Xero. There were some great experiences that I had at those companies, but I started to have a realization that if I'm working 60-hour weeks, I really want it to be worthwhile and to actually be making a difference in the world, which is why I then moved to, I guess, reconsider what I was doing in my life. So I thought that I could, oh, she's whimpering, sorry. I had an epiphany that I want to help people, I guess, eat better and live healthier lives. So at that point, I wanted to be a dietitian working in hospital clinics. So I moved to Melbourne and started an undergraduate nutrition degree, which would then be followed by my postgraduate Masters of Dietetics. But whilst I was studying, I started taking some really interesting subjects about the sustainability of the food system, or I guess the lack of the sustainability of the food system. And it really triggered something in me. And I started thinking, well, perhaps that's actually where the greatest need is. And that's where I could affect change for the most number of people if I started working towards food system sustainability. At the same time I was studying, I was also working at Uber in the head office. Again, it's a startup company, and I think it had a lot of parallels in terms of an organization that was scaling really fast and had similar regulation issues that you see now in plant-based meat labeling. So although it wasn't directly related, a lot of the skills that I learned at Uber are now useful in my career at Food Frontier. Towards the end of my degree, I started working as a community planning officer at Maroona City Council, and that was really useful for me to think about how I really enjoyed helping in health and nutrition. And towards the end of my degree, whilst I was pulling together my master's application, a role at Food Frontier came up, but it was a comms role. And I was a little bit torn because I just changed my career away from comms. But here was a really interesting organization, an organization that had values that really aligned to me. It was working to make the food system more sustainable. And I kind of had to question again, can I still make a difference in the world if I'm working in a comms role? And the answer is yes, you definitely can. It turned out that I got the job, so I didn't actually continue on studying my Masters of Dietetics. And in my conversations with Food Frontier, I then was able to have have my role changed slightly to be research and content manager, and that would reflect the change, or I guess reflect what I wanted to be looking at in the world of alternative proteins, and that's becoming a a subject matter expert on all things alternative proteins. So I'll go on to the next slide. So at Food Frontier, we kind of have 3 pillars, and that's the work that we support. So we support the industry, we also work in thought leadership, and we also have policy engagement. So, oops, oh gosh, sorry. So my work supports all 3 of these pillars. There's lots of different things happening all the time. Basically, we want to demonstrate the economic and environmental opportunity to both the industry, to policyholders, and also other stakeholders such as the general public. And one of the main reasons that we do, one of the main ways that we do that, and one of the main things that I work on at Food Frontier, and this is just our team. We've got a new CEO, Jane Sydenham-Clark, who's taken over from our founder, Thomas King. Some of you might know Thomas King. You might have seen him on the ABC. He's a very inspirational person to work with, and I'm very glad to work at Food Frontier with him. So he's moved into a chair role, and Jane's going to be leading us as CEO from now on. So yeah, going back to the work that I work on mostly, it is our reports. So our major report that we do quite frequently is our State of the Industry report, and this tracks the growth of the plant-based meat industry in Australia. Our last one was in 2019, and the most recent one tracks the data of FY20. These reports are really useful to demonstrate the growth to both policy makers and also investors, to demonstrate what the opportunities are. So you can see on the next slide some of the stats that come out of these reports. So we work with Deloitte Access Economics to produce these reports, or to get the data that underpins these reports. And then we compile them with a whole lot of contextual information, information about the industry, about case studies, about products that are on shelves in Australia. And it's how, I guess, we envision that someone who's never really understood the world of alternative proteins before, they can pick up one of these reports and get a really good snapshot of what's going on in the industry. One of the things that we put in these reports are our predictions for where plant-based meat will be in 2030. We haven't yet done predictions for cellular agriculture, and this was, I mean, last time that we did one of these reports, cellular agriculture was still so small, and in the last 6 months it's grown incredibly, even in Australia. So I think the next report will probably have some kind of prediction for cellular agriculture as well. Another report that I've worked on is the report we did in 2020, which was analysing the nutrition of plant-based meat and determining if it is a healthier alternative. It's a world-first report that we did in conjunction with an accredited practicing dietitian called Dr. Terry Lichtenstein. And so this report looked at the nutrition of products that were on shelves at that time and compared them with their direct counterparts in conventional meat. So that's burger for burger and sausage for sausage, not, say, a burger compared to a beefsteak. That's not really comparable. And it just looked to see what the comparisons are for protein, fats, carbohydrates, and ingredients such as additives. It is, I guess, almost quite a basic way to analyze products, but for someone who, for the uninitiated, or for the uninitiated, and for an organization that doesn't have a lab to analyze the products, it was still really useful information to understand how these products can fit into someone's diet, and if they are, according to the labels, potentially an alternative. And it's important to note as well that a lot of the food that plant-based meat is replacing is normally a processed counterpart. Something else that I work on a lot are industry resources. So on the left, we have market profiles. So we did 7 of these last year for markets across Asia. And these are for plant-based meat companies in Australia and New Zealand who are looking to export and are not quite sure what markets they want to enter. And it gave them information about tariffs, about labeling laws, about who else is in market. So both local and international competitors. What are the formats and what are consumer, I guess, demands or any consumer data from those markets? So across Asia, it can be quite fragmented. Some markets like Singapore and China are really advanced. Other markets like India or Indonesia might only have a few companies or are just kind of emerging. So it's really useful for Australian companies to have that context. A lot of Australian companies will think about exporting their products fairly early on in their journey, given that we are on the doorstep of Asia, and it is, as Simon said, the world's biggest protein market. And my most stressful report to work on to date was the analysis of plant-based meat labels on shelves. So I got to look at 252 products on shelves currently, look at all their labels and put all that data into a table and figure out I guess how plant-based meat products are labeled, how they're presenting themselves, and what qualifiers they're using, and how many products are calling themselves are using just format terms. So a format term we would say is burger, sausage, fillet, compared to how many products we're using an animal meat term as a flavor indicator. So that would be chicken or beef or things like that. And then if they were using an animal meat term, were they appropriately qualifying it? Were they saying it's plant-based or chicken-free chicken or no meat patty, whatever it is. So that data was really useful because I don't know if you've seen, but there was a Senate inquiry into the labeling of plant-based meat products. It was a pretty heated debate. There's a lot of, I guess, feeling on both sides of that debate. So it's what we wanted to do there is have some real data on how the products are presenting themselves at the moment. Food Frontier tries to be a data-driven organization at all times. So we were able to determine that there's only a really, really small minority of products that are perhaps using animal imagery or are not labeling their products with really, really clear qualifiers that determine that they're plant-based. And another thing that I do at Food Frontier is our news and content pages. So I look after our news page on the website, look after our social media pages as well. I guess part of my role of being like a subject matter expert in all things alternative proteins means that I know a lot about what's going on in the industry, both in Australia and overseas, but the industry is so dynamic, it's growing all the time. I learn 20 new things every single day, and I'm always kind of wowed by how much there is to know and how much things are changing and so quickly as well. So the news pages and the social pages keep me pretty busy, and I'd love to update them more than I could. If I had 3 clones of myself, I would. Something we're working towards at the moment, and that's taken up a lot of my time, is the first ever Alternative Proteins Conference in Australia and New Zealand. So we're hosting that on the 17th of May. I hope we're hosting it because we've had to put it back twice now because of COVID. So this is our 3rd attempt at hosting Alt Proteins 22. It is completely sold out. We've got 140 people on our wait list at the moment. It's got a really great lineup of speakers from both Australia, Singapore, New Zealand, and America. And we've got a really great mix of people coming from policymakers, from private investment, from researchers, companies. So it's going to be a really great day. We're really looking forward to it, if it happens, fingers crossed. So I just want to summarize with how you can get involved in alternative proteins. First of all, it's really, I guess, common to say, but internship and work placements are a really great way to get involved. We have on our website something called the company database, and it lists all the companies in Australia and New Zealand that are working in the alternative protein space. So you might want to have a look at that database and then approach some of those companies directly and see if any of those companies are working in a technology field that you have skills in, or perhaps you can see on the website that they're looking for someone, maybe they need volunteers, maybe they need interns, maybe they have a position in their marketing team. It's not just scientific roles that are out there. And by getting out there and researching what's available and being open to possibilities, you can hopefully find the job of your dreams. I would recommend that you think outside the box being Australia and New Zealand. The alternative proteins in sector in both countries is really small, and compared to other nations, it's, I'd say, 3 years behind compared to what it is Europe and America. What's going on right now in like Singapore, in Israel, in the Netherlands, even in the UK and America, they've got, I guess, a huge amount more funding. They've got, in some cases, really progressive governments who are really interested in food security. And they, I just say that every time I look to what they're doing, I think that'll be us in 3 years. So you might want to consider what else is out there, and perhaps there's a market for you over in San Fran or something like that. And it may not fall into place straight away, but that doesn't mean that it won't eventuate. It might take a few years to build up the skills or to get to your dream job in alt proteins, but I think it will definitely happen if you keep at it. And this last slide just has our contact details. We do have an intern at the moment at Food Frontier, but we will probably have more internship roles available throughout the year. And if you're ever interested in something similar or you want some advice, feel free to drop us a line at the info@email address. Thank you.
Hey, thank you so much, Clara. Really interesting to hear about your journey and how alternative proteins wasn't necessarily the end goal. So yeah, thanks for sharing. And thanks again to our 3 speakers. I'm now going to hand over to Alistair, who's going to run us through the question and answer.
Thank you, Sophie. Yep, so again, we've got the link on screen here. It's also in chat. So keep putting through any questions that pop up. You can also like or kind of vote for questions that are already put through, and then we'll kind of go through these based on what seems to be the most popular ones. Okay, first up, I guess the winner of the likes for Simon. My friends and family in Asia get very defensive when I talk about the ethical issues with animal protein. How would you suggest to address this?
That's a great question. So, I mean, firstly, I would say don't try to force the issue. I don't think the direct approach works for most people. I think that before you do that, it's good to kind of have an understanding about, the basics of how people change their points of view. And, most people are not EAs, pretty rational. They can go and look through arguments and totally flip their point of view if there's a great argument listed down that makes sense and is logically sound. So that would be the first point. I would say this kind of indirect approach. So for example, there was a YouTube video that I kind of stumbled into. I guess the algorithms are pretty good, which is about someone who kind of took a lobster home from the supermarket and decided to kind of raise the lobster as a pet. And it was just really mesmerizing, and it got millions of views, and there's a whole series. So if anyone's interested, check out Leon the Lobster on YouTube. And I think that's a good kind of way of, indirect approach of kind of like letting people kind of have baby steps to kind of understand about that these are not just kind of, products for consumption, but they're also living, breathing, feeling kind of, sentient beings. So I think this kind of indirect approach. And then on the food side, go and take them to the, really, really tasty vegan restaurants. Let them go and try, these great things, and they may kind of slowly have a change, but don't expect people to change. They may have been decades, eating animals. It's part of their core identity, their cultural identity. Their parents who they love used to feed them, animal foods as a kid growing up. These are strong, deep emotional ties. So you don't kind of unwire those things overnight. It takes time. Keep planting seeds.
Thank you. That's really interesting. Jen, what are some of the things we can do to help safeguard alt-pro startups from being influenced / absorbed into some of those more negative or kind of old school institutions like Tyson, Nestle, any of those?
If I paraphrase the question is, so how do we overthrow capitalism? Which is obviously a very easy and straightforward question to address. In the short term, there's no way around this. We have lots of small independent businesses, but the system and the structure and the incentives push them to, sell to a larger one, get that money, have the investors, and just grow and grow and grow. That is just the incentives that the system have. things that would be good and would help address this would be, you know, enforcing competition law, having antitrust regulation. In the US, there's some really interesting sort of push from the FTC in terms of antitrust around Google, Facebook, and some of the large tech industries. And I think, you know, from a very individual standpoint, you could vote for people. We're about to have an election in Australia, right? Vote for people who actually want to regulate and enforce antitrust, you know, support for the ACCC, other things like that. That's a very sort of individual level thing. And then I guess, you know, if we're doing more on that individual thing, you could try to purchase from companies and products that aren't owned by some of those large, massive corporations. But I would say advocacy for regulation around that, and advocacy to have sort of a greater, more diverse, flourishing, competitive market is always very positive. We're going to get more innovation if we have smaller companies as well. Innovation always starts with the small guys. So those are my sort of individual targeted options.
Okay.
Can I add to that at all, Jen?
Hop in, Flora.
It's something that I've wrestled with a lot as well at Food Frontier. You will often see companies like Tyson purchasing plant-based meat companies like Vera in Europe, and you can view it as them just trying to shore up their markets, which I'm sure they absolutely are. But I sometimes draw the analogy between fossil fuel companies buying green energy companies or starting solar companies. If we want to create change in a system, it's slow and gradual, and sometimes the change has to come from within. And so whilst it's not the most ethical form of alternative protein production, it is ultimately going to be a bit more sustainable. Sorry, the dog's ripping up a toy, which is the noise you can hear in the background. It is moving the system towards slightly more ethical. Well, in some ways it's more sustainable, or there's less animal suffering when these companies do get involved. So I think it's shades of gray, but it doesn't mean it's perfect. But I mean, yeah, it's a tricky area.
On that point of kind of, I guess, policymakers' roles there, Clara, what do you think other avenues they can have an impact are? I guess it's hard to, you know, have an impact on policymakers ourselves. What do you think the role they have to play in AltPro is?
In terms of increasing its, expanding alternative proteins?
Expanding and also kind of maintaining that competition.
I mean, there's a lot of things they can do. There's a lot of things that they're never going to do, I guess, in Australia. I think competition laws, yep, I would agree with Jen on antitrust laws and anti-competitive behaviour. I think that is something that could be worked on. I think that governments need to be more open when it comes to considering what areas of the economy they're willing to support. I think that the current government is beholden to the Nationals, or beholden to what it sees as country votes, and so it will always want to look after farmers. There's two people in Canberra you can't criticise, and it's veterans and it's farmers. And you need to, I guess, in my view, the recent Senate inquiry is an example of the government trying to be quite protective of the animal ag industry. So having a government that is more open to different forms of food production would be great. And just having a long-term view, thinking 20, 10, 15 years ahead, not just thinking in a 3-year election cycle, would really help when it comes to, thinking about the changes we need to have a more sustainable food system.
100%. To pass back to you, Simon, what do you think the most promising future interventions for wild animal suffering at the moment?
Sure. Well, the first to say I'm a beginner on this topic. And so I would say, like, the very first thing and the immediate thing that needs to be done is foundational research. A lot more kind of research needs to be done before we start looking at kind of real serious interventions. So in the kind of immediate term, I think I was listening to a podcast, maybe it was 80,000 Hours podcast or something, and the researchers said that there's only in the world something like only 15 people working on this full-time, working on wild animal suffering in the whole world, you know, out of our billions and billions of people of our species. Only 15 are working on this. So, if you join, you're going to have a huge kind of impact on that. So I think foundational research, one. I think also like baby steps. What can we do, for example, in pesticides and fertilizers, things that kind of, can be done to be more humane towards, creatures. Also, I'd say that, even like low-hanging fruit about like, not having gardens, not having lawns in the traditional sense, and maybe kind of moving towards, spaces that we control ourselves. But really, it's a long game. I mean, it's going to be decades and decades of work to kind of slowly get people to kind of, understand this issue. But I think the sooner that we start, the sooner we can get progress. Long term, ultimately, I think gene editing technology has a lot of promise for kind of, engineering things. And there's a lot of interesting kind of early work in vaccinations as well. So I think there's potential is really great. But I think baby steps first.
Okay, that's really interesting. Wild animal suffering, I remember when I first came across it, it was a really strange kind of course area, I guess. It's one that is kind of very outside of our cultural kind of conception of ethics at the moment. This question is for all speakers, but I might pass it through to Jen first of all, but feel free, Clara and Simon, to jump in if you have thoughts. How do you think regulation can be used to support the alt-pro industry without stumping innovation?
I mean, there's lots of things that could be done. I think, okay, so one thing, government can fund that research. So what Simon's talking about in terms of some of that very basic research, government doesn't want to fund that anymore. So if we have more public funding for this, we can do high quality independent research. And I don't mean just in sort of that food science technology space. There needs to be research in nutrition, there needs to be research in sustainability, there needs to be research on, the political implications of this, the trade implications of this, the economic implications of this. I'm a researcher, I'm gonna ask for money from the government, sure. Truth in labeling and transparency, I think, would be very useful. The Senate inquiry that Clara was referring to. There's marketing and then there's information around this. And I think the other thing that would be very useful in that space would be, having more accurate information from a nutrition and perhaps a sustainability messaging around that. That would be especially useful. I probably have a perhaps slightly different perspective around what I'd want to put on the label, but that would be one that would be very useful. And then I guess thinking outside the box, perhaps in terms of what innovation would look like. And so I think if I go slightly outside the alternative protein box and take a very loose interpretation of alternative protein to mean alternatives to the very problematic protein meat production, which is industrial agriculture, there are alternative proteins, alternatives to industrial agriculture that might not tick that sort of novel protein box, small scale, most cattle is owned by indigenous farmers, a lot of whom are women in the global south. So that is an alternative to the industrial food system that isn't a high-tech vegan thing, but it's still an alternative. So I think being able to have more nuanced conversations around what constitutes as innovation and as an alternative to what, I think would also be very helpful. Sometimes plant-based and sometimes meat or protein are painted with very broad homogenizing brushes, and that does a big disservice.
That's interesting to think about, kind of getting out of that binary, alternate protein good, traditional protein bad, but thinking more about kind of the ethics and industry around it. Okay. For Clara, so good to see the reports. How do you think these findings can be translated to policy or real practices?
So there's a number of ways they can be. The first is using the data from reports, particularly like our state of the industry reports, to demonstrate the potential growth or the jobs value. That's something that governments love to see. And we've had some success in our conversations with state governments around getting them to want to fund plant-based production facilities. Something that we recently saw was the South Australian announcement of Australian plant proteins. They're building a huge three new fractionation facilities in South Australia, and that's funded partly by the South Australian state government and the federal government. And if you told me that would happen 2 years ago when I started at Food Frontier, I would have laughed at you that a Liberal federal government and a Liberal state government were going to fund a plant processing facility. I honestly would never have thought that would be possible, but it's because of the data in our report, in reports from CSIRO and other reports that governments can, if they can't see the other benefits, they can at least see the economic benefits. And that's sometimes you have to be pragmatic about what information you need to give to certain stakeholders that's going to get them across the line to get the result that you want. Maybe sometimes they're not going to care about, the altruistic reasons for investing in alternative proteins, but they are going to care about the economic. Other things I'd like to see, I just want to echo Jen's point as well about sustainability labeling. That's something I would love to see. I think it could be a real game changer for the entire food system. And I don't know if I'll ever see it in my lifetime, but I'd really love to see sustainability labeling on all foods. It'd be incredible.
Thanks for that, Clara. To pass one on to Simon, you mentioned earlier kind of the cultural embedding of meat eating across the world. What are some ways we can work to address that and work past that? Or is it really just a matter of time to make meat eating less kind of culturally significant?
Well, time is definitely one requirement. These things don't happen, but I mean, I think you can think about analogies of what else has changed in the last kind of couple of decades or so of in kind of societal viewpoints, whether it's progress towards more equality and kind of acceptance of gay marriage in many kind of Western countries, and starting a little bit in Asia. What changed? And I think it was education, inspiration, kind of like getting rid of the kind of, the feeling that this is some big enemy of your identity or of the way you've been doing things. But it's really about kind of the baby steps to kind of embrace change and then kind of go further. And we don't need everyone to be, perfect and never have any animal products at all. We want them to go and take, changes. So, Meatless Mondays and flexitarian, I'm really encouraged by, the fact that 1/3 of Australians are actively kind of cutting down their meat and dairy consumption. And now plant-based milks, for example, are taking, more than 10% of the market, actually, significantly more in the US and Australia and other places. So I think this kind of incremental approach on both sides, education, inspiration, products, they all kind of add up together to progress. So that would be my thought.
100%. Jen, it's interesting to see the claims in conventional meat products. Does the government have any stance on that? Are they protective of the meat industry?
I'm wondering if the claims on conventional meat products is in reference to the research that I presented, in which case those were claims on alternative protein products that were owned by conventional meat companies. I mean, in terms of the claims that conventional meat products make, in some ways they're very similar to the alternative protein claims. Other than the plant-based one, a lot of them talk about, health benefits, health claims. And I guess I'm a researcher. I'm always hung up on definitions, right? When we say conventional meat products, are we talking about, a roast chicken, or are we talking about a McDonald's hamburger? Because both of those are sometimes referred to as conventional meat products, but there's a world of difference. Similarly, a plant-based diet could be lentils and tofu, or it could be the Impossible Burger and fermented perfect day, dairy products. So in terms of, I guess, the government stance on it, in the Australian context, what Clara said is true. Farmers can't be criticized. There's an ideological imperative across government to protect the dairy and the meat industry. Two national senators in particular have been very active in promoting those interests. I don't think, but they're not necessarily protective of the meat industry per se. And I think there's a very important thing here when we talk about meat. I'm trying to unpack these conflations, right? There are cattle farmers and there are meat processors. And those are two very, very, very different groups within the food system. Cattle farmers are diverse. They are farmers, they are on the ground, they are very fragmented. They are not necessarily, like huge conglomerates. Meat processors, that's when we start talking about Tyson and Purdue and ConAgra and huge sort of multinational firms. Those are the ones that are investing and buying in the alternative protein space. And those are not necessarily the ones that in the Australian context, the government is trying to protect. The government is more from an ideological standpoint, trying to, protect like the lone farmer on the land, blah, 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 blah. So they are protecting a segment of the meat industry, but I think that's also then why we would see that South Australian example where we're investing in an Australian startup and investing in some of that Australian agriculture. If we're talking about alternative proteins, the horticulture industry is going to be incredibly important here because that's where all the pulses, the grains, and the other sort of ingredients that go into those processed plant products then come from. So there's an agricultural dimension of this, and there's a processor dimension of this. And I would say, depending on where we sit and what country we're looking at, I imagine if we shifted our focus to Singapore or the US or to the EU, we'd see slightly different dynamics in terms of which companies and segments of the industry are most important to the government market share. So that's probably a way more complicated answer than you were looking for. Sorry.
Fair enough. It sounds like a complicated field. Yeah, John.
Can I just add in? I think a good kind of simple answer to our government protective of farmers and the wider meat industry is yes. I mean, if you look at the climate change summaries and reports, every time the research and the scientists say that, hey, reducing meat consumption is important, those things get deleted and omitted from the summaries, the important kind of outcomes, and just search online and you'll see all the references there. So I think that is unfortunately the starting point, subsidization, protection. We have to innovate around that, but we also need to work on those areas. And I think South Australia is a wonderful, wonderful example. Like, took us all out of the blue, and I think it's a kind of hats off to the hard work of the local campaigners to put that together. But yeah, that's the sort of steps that we need to take forward.
100%. For you, Clara, do you feel like, to take it kind of in a less alternate protein focused area and more careers in general, do you feel like the shifting around in your career, moving from different interest areas, helped give you a diverse experience that helped in your career and your impact? Or do you think there's benefits to kind of picking something and kind of taking a more direct path?
That's a good question. I mean, it wasn't intentional. I started off thinking I wanted to do one thing and then realized that was not fulfilling me. And so that was why I changed. I personally get a lot of satisfaction out of having had different diverse experiences. There's so many different things that I think have led me to this point that are useful in my role today. I guess the common thread is that I've always usually worked with startup companies that are scaling. So that is quite useful for alternative proteins. I guess the one downside is that most of my friends are like senior or in like kind of the higher end of their careers, and I'm kind of had to start mine over again. So I do sometimes feel like I guess I kind of went backwards in that respect, but at the same time, the personal satisfaction that I get from the role that I'm doing now is so great that it's definitely worth it. I also think that you can't be expected to know what you're going to want to do in 10 years time or in 15 years time. And I imagine that I'll probably change my career or my focus over the next 20 years again. So I don't think we have to be wedded to one concept, and being open to change is a really useful thing.
Okay, for Jen, what was the most interesting breakthrough / finding in research that you've done for AltPro? Anything stick out in particular?
I guess a lot of my interest is around ultra processing. And I think, and it's not really something that we went into great depths in the paper that we published, but the ways that companies rationalize talking about processing or not talking about processing was really interesting, in the sense that you have companies like Impossible Foods that say, of course we're processing, but everything is processed, right? Cooking food and sort of, we've, had pickles forever, we've fermented stuff, whatever. And so there's sort of the straw man argument that a lot of food science, people use, that sort of conflates processing and ultra processing, whereas a lot of sort of the public health nutritionists make a clear line in the sand between those two things. So it's interesting there. And then others who say, oh, well, but we're not processed. We don't have, it's Impossible Foods that's engaging with this sort of genetic modified stuff, and that's processing, and that's very dangerous. Whereas we, have all of these natural ingredients. It's kind of like, yes, but your first ingredient is like pea protein isolate. So like that's obviously a processed ingredient. And then you have others who are completely silent about that. And then there was this whole sort of debate in the New York Times, where they're kicking back and forth, where you've got all of a sudden, the Center for Consumer Freedom, which is a right-wing think tank that, did consulting work for the tobacco industry, right? Like not a great stakeholder. All of a sudden they're engaged in this debate, and they're like part of, supporting the cattle industry, attacking, like the fake meat, clean meat. And you just have these fantastically interesting players coming in, using all kinds of different arguments, plucking them out for convenience sake, and they might say them differently. And I think that's really interesting to sort of see how companies are coming into this space, and how this sort of very technical public health nutrition concept of ultra processing is all of a sudden being used as a sort of political marketing tool in this space. That was fascinating.
Seeing kind of the old industry kind of institutions coming in, taking advantage of that kind of inconsistency, I guess, or that opportunity. Does anything else come to mind, Jen, in terms of other risks where if the AltPro industry doesn't think about how we approach this, there's avenues for it to get criticized?
It's a really interesting question.
Yeah. Sorry to put you on the spot there, but
I think there's a number of potential risks. I think there's the existential risk that the IPES report does a really good job of unpacking. And the existential risk is that we pick a problem and define it a little bit too narrowly. Like a lot of the research is around, greenhouse gases. Greenhouse gases are one of a whole range of sustainability metrics. There's deforestation, there's land use, there's, pollution, there's biodiversity loss. There's lots of other things that completely get ignored. Animal welfare is one of many forms of suffering. We've got the human suffering. Anyone who read COVID headlines knows that like the human workforce in the industrial meat processing, and sometimes in the plant-based stuff as well, depending on what supply chain we look at, is horrifying. So I think depending on how we define that problem and what the issue is, some very important issues could get left out. And I guess the other one, and the sort of corporate one that I think is really interesting, is making sure that, as Simon sort of pointed to, if we're trying to have that sort of transition of diets, and I'll be the first to say, people in Australia and the US and other countries eat way too much meat. Oh my God. Not everyone, but like at a population level. But lots of areas of the world don't. So there's a lot of diversity that needs to be recognized in this, and especially from a global South standpoint. So much of the money, the investment, the companies, the research, everything comes from a global North perspective that is very silent on some of the voices that aren't really part of that conversation yet. And I think there's a risk that this will be perceived as a very neo-colonial, very global north, very white, very middle class sort of solution that is imposed on people who never asked for it in the first place. And I think that would be my other existential crisis. And there's many people who are working to overcome this, but I think many people haven't considered that.
Well, thank you very much, Jen, Clara, and Simon. Unfortunately, that's going to be the last question tonight, just to keep time on track. Are there any other last kind of closing thoughts for you, Clara, Simon, also Jen? Any other thoughts that have popped up throughout the Q&A section that you want to chuck in before we move on to wrapping things up?
Yeah, maybe just a quick one. Just on the kind of comment about like, processed or not. Just to, we used to get insulin from the pancreas of pigs, that we used to go to pigs, go and extract this from their bodies and go and do that to go and have our shots. And now we produce it all synthetically and no one complains about that. And it's a great step forward. We don't have to go and have this kind of cruel way of giving people their kind of important, medication. And I think that that's kind of an example of where this is going. We're using technology, we're harnessing it and providing something that's a lot better. And I think, I'm excited that everyone here has kind of got a level of interest in this and hopefully can join in on that. Just one quick note as well, we have internships, so just reach out if this is something interesting, but also can help out with mentoring if you've got any questions about career or want some advice. I'm happy to help. Thanks.
Perfect. Thank you, Simon. Okay, so just to wrap up for tonight, if you want to do some more reading into alternate proteins, these sources that should come up on the screen in a second, here we are. These are great places to check out. Good Food Institute has been brought up tonight. It's a really big non-profit presence in the Australian alt-pro industry. Better Bite Ventures, where Simon's very heavily involved, really important source of support for alt-pro startups. There's also close to home, University of Melbourne have their Future Food Hallmark Research Institute. And as Clara discussed, Food Frontier is an Australian think tank addressing alt-pro that has a really big impact on policymakers and industry decision makers. Finally, Cellular Agriculture Australia has a really cool job board for looking for internships or even kind of grad positions. And as Marion mentioned, a really cool interactive tool called Pathways in Cell Ag, if you want to look further into kind of different options for careers in this industry. I'll just pass it off to Marion to kind of talk about the Pro Initiative.
Thank you, Alistair. So yeah, if you want to get involved as a student as well, there is the University of Melbourne Alternative Protein Initiative at the university. That is right. We are a group of students trying to change the food system and making it more sustainable and just. And how we're going to do that is to build a community around alternative protein research, education, innovation, and entrepreneurship. Now, what that kind of means is we have a lot of educational events like this. I'll talk more about it later as well. We have a journal club where people can get involved in sharing and discussing alternative protein research. We're also holding an alternative protein curriculum campaign where we have an opportunity to tell our educators how we'd like to see our curriculums change so we can better understand how to get involved into this awesome field. You can sign up as a member so we make sure you're updated with all our upcoming events and projects. We're also always looking for people in committee as well. So we have different like teams, including entrepreneurship, education, research, marketing, socials, events, and we're all working collaboratively together to kind of grow this alternative protein space at our university. Also, keep an eye out for our upcoming events. So yes, we have one coming right today. We have a pub night happening in 30 minutes or so at the Clyde. If you are around University of Melbourne, that's just 5 minutes away. If you want to, talk about this with me and other alternative protein loving individuals. All right, and also we've got an entrepreneurship related event coming up on the 27th of April. And there's going to be a lot more information coming on that on our socials. So make sure you check that out too. And I really want to mention, thank you so much to all the wonderful speakers. You guys are so articulate, and it's so interesting talking about these concepts that I don't really get to kind of interact with it on a normal like student daily life as a student. So that was really awesome. And a huge thank you to the EA's team for making this collaboration happen. It was such an awesome event, as well as the educations team from our initiative for putting some of the slides together. So thank you.
Cheers, Marion. Yeah, so if you enjoyed tonight or some of the effective altruism ideas that popped up, you found particularly interesting, this QR code on screen takes to a link tree. There's a bunch of links there where you can look more about the club effective altruism at UniMelb, but also information sources for EA in general. In particular, the website 80,000 Hours, I think is really interesting. Its focuses on careers and thinking, okay, I'm going to spend 80,000 hours in a career. How can I best do good with those hours and that effort? There's also effectivealtruism.org, which is good for kind of base foundational knowledge and some of the foundational ideas around effective altruism. Yeah, again, if you enjoyed this event, please do take a look at EA UniMelb. I've had a great experience both socially and in the ways the club has broadened my worldview. We've also got a great set of events coming up, both social and like tonight. We've got Dial Night in week 9, and we have another Q&A panel like tonight about careers within developmental economics and global health. That's going on in week 8. And there's always a broader way of interesting stuff going on. So yeah, definitely check that out if tonight was up your alley. Yeah, to wrap up, thank you everyone for coming out. I found this really interesting. Thank you so much to our speakers. The questions were really great. It was really interesting looking into what is a really nuanced and interesting new industry. There's a lot of thoughts I didn't think would be relevant here, like how do you interact with policymakers and old institutions that are big power players within this industry. So thank you very much for coming out. Thank you, speakers, for taking the time out of your night. Yeah, shout out also, before we finish off, to Stella, our events director at EA, Sophie, Marion, for organizing and emceeing tonight. Yeah, everyone, hope you have a good night, and yeah, see you around, hopefully.
Lovely to meet you all.
Thanks for